I learned this amazing trick recently. If you are on mute, you can just push your space bar and it will unmute you for just a second, and as soon as you let go, you'll be muted again.
Just my space bar?
Exactly.
I'll have to try later.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sharon Navas. I'm the co-founder and executive director of the Equity in Education Coalition. For those of you that don't know who we are Washington's only civil rights organization that looks at closing the educational opportunity gap for kids of color, Native, Indigenous, immigrant, undocumented throughout Washington state by looking at systems that affect our children even before they get to the school building. It is our belief that if a student or a family is living in an unhoused, unhealthy, or violent environment, if their basic needs are not being met, then they're really not ready for the educational system and for the our systems should work to our education. Our systems should work for our kids as opposed to our kids working for our systems. With that, just a couple of housekeeping issues. We are recording today's session. We do record every Lunch and Learn. We will download it and then throw it up on our YouTube page and our Facebook page so that it is available for people that can't be on right now. We will have that up as soon as we get that on our YouTube page. Also, if you look at the top left corner of your screen, you should see something that says live on otter.ai live notes. That is for folks that need closed captioning or live transcriptions. It is taking everybody's words and proactively doing a live transcription now. So we also have those notes available for everyone as they need it. What else? We will be muting everybody except for our panelists. So if you have a question, please drop it in the chat. And then just let us know. Sorry, we're having some back of the house sort of issues right now, so just bear with me. What else? That's it. Oh, I'm gonna do a quick land acknowledgement. And I'm gonna do it a little bit different. I do wanna acknowledge that we are on stolen land that was taken through systemic and years of genocide and violence. I do also want to acknowledge that as we do land acknowledgements in our systems now, we have a hard time with them because we go immediately into colonizer conversations around how we're going to change our children, our societies, and our cultures to fit white organizational cultures and systems. So as our land acknowledgement, I want us to keep in mind that we are on stolen land, taken systemic genocide, and how do we decolonize our systems so that our systems work for our kids as opposed to our cultures, communities, and children changing for our systems. So let's bear that in mind. Also, we do center voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So if you find yourself as a white presenting person or as a white person taking up a lot of space, I will sort of virtually tap you on the shoulder and let you know to recenter and allow for space for our communities. And I might do it in a nice way, but I'm also feeling salty today, so we don't know. Yeah, Stephanie, that's right. Feel free to, we are in a lunch and learn, so feel free to lunch while you're learning. I've got my protein bars and all kinds of liquids here. So I am going to toss it over to our education specialist and all around lunch and learn queen, Renika Massey-Jones, who will be moderating today's lunch and learn. So have a great time. Please, if anything, drop it in the chat and
Hi, everybody. So I'm your Renika, I almost said narrator, your moderator for today. I want to first start off by thanking everybody for being here. And I would like to take a moment to let our panelists introduce themselves. And we can start with Tess.
Good morning. My name is Tess. I'm a teacher at Daybreak Star Preschool in Magnolia. We're the only native preschool in Seattle.
Thank you for joining us. Deborah.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Deborah Lee. I'm Salt River, Pima, Maricopa, and Chicano. I am the co-founder and board president of the Washington Indian Civil Rights Commission. I'm also, for my day job, I'm also the director for the Nisqually Tribe, Early Head Start, Healthy Families, and Early Childhood Disabilities programs.
Thank you. Charles.
Hey, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name is my name is Charles Atkins. I'm a proud enrolled member of the Yurok tribe of Klamath, California. I use he, him, his pronouns, and my day job is being a engagement coordinator for the Mockingbird Society and training homeless and foster youth how to do advocacy.
Thank you for joining us. Tanya?
Hi, everyone. My name is Tanya Burns. I am a Tulalip tribal member, and I am the education director at the Soxhawtla Indian Tribe near Darrington, Washington. And I'm joined by Nino Maltos, and I'll let him introduce himself.
I am Nino Maltos. I'm from the Upper Skagit Indian Tribe. My kids are enrolled in the Soxhawtla Indian Tribe, and I work as a recreation director for the Soxhawtla Indian Tribe.
Thank you for joining us. So, how we usually do the Lunch and Learns is we have some questions that the EEC has come up with, and then we have our participants drop their questions in the chat, and I will be able to ask you those as well. So, and Patsy Whitefoot.
Shikpachwe Ignashwinik Sheshtwapit to Question Wiki Patricia Whitefoot. I introduce myself and my language of the Yakama Nation. I'm a citizen of the Yakama Nation and was born and raised here and have lived on my reservation pretty much all my life, except for periods of time when I went to college. And today I'm a retired educator, having been in education for over 40 years. And so during this COVID era, I've been providing childcare, and I'm doing a number of things, not only with my family, but with others in the greater community that I'm connected with. So I'm glad to be here with all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being with us today. So to get us started, my first question I have for y'all is, what role did Catholic boarding schools have in the education of Native children?
So I'd like to, sorry, I have to go back and forth to mute and unmute here, so please bear with me. As an individual who was a part of the boarding school in my childhood, not only was I personally enrolled in the boarding school, but also my grandmother was who raised me. She was a part of the Fort Simcoe Military School, and having been raised by her and having that, those practices a part of my life, I feel like I've been just kind of acclimated to boarding schools. But when it comes to the Catholic boarding schools here in the United States, I think it's important to also take a look at some of the policies that led up to these Catholic boarding schools or any religious boarding schools, because in the history of boarding schools, it includes not only the Catholics, but also the Presbyterians, the Episcopalians, and many other religious denominations. So I think it's important to point out that in 1819, there was the Indian Civilization Act and the Peace Policy, which the United States conducted in concert and with the urging of several denominations of Christian churches that developed this Indian boarding school policy. And basically the intent was to implement cultural genocide through the removal and reprogramming of American Indian Alaska Native children and the systemic destruction of Native cultures and communities. And basically the purpose was to kill the Indian and save the man. And I noticed you had an article, the Atlantic, that was referenced. You'll find that in there in addition to other articles as well. I've been doing some research on boarding schools because of my own experience. And the more that I've learned, I've just learned the fact that you know, the intent was to basically just to systematically rid this land of Native people, and yet we are still here. I do want to speak to the fact that, you know, there was major mistreatment of our children, and it's something that I also experienced myself personally. So we were forcibly abducted by Indian agencies, and my grandmother, when she went to the military school, she was but a child. She was, you know, she might have been 5 or 6, but she was there for a short period of time. And so where she went, you know, these places that I'm talking about, I live about a mile from each one. So I was in the a mission boarding school, which was about a mile east of me, and where our family land is. My grandmother was in the military school about a mile west of me. So I live right in between these two institutions that had a major impact on my life and continues to have an impact on my life today. And so these boarding schools were in place from 1862, just as recently of 1970. And I have a niece who was in a boarding school as well in Oregon, the Chamawa Indian School, and she left that place because of the mistreatment that she was subjected to. So the role of Catholic boarding schools, basically the role was that they were the instigator, you know, in implementing these policies, along with other religious organizations with the federal government. And when you look at the history, you'll see and I don't have the specifics of it right now, but you'll see all of these religious organizations and the number of children that were part of those schools. And with the Catholic boarding schools, of course, they numbered in the thousands of students, but then the Episcopalian and Presbyterian and all of that, they also numbered in the thousands. And these were some of the schools that had the highest number of Native students. And these schools were, you know, established primarily on Indian reservations as well. And in my case, it was in our original homelands and where I continue to live today. And it's estimated that I think it's important to also note that I've been a part of the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition and was one of the co-founders of that coalition, which still is in existence today. And we continue to address some of these issues. So in the boarding schools, it's estimated there were 500, and today there's identified at least 357 boarding schools in 30 states. That's almost 400 boarding schools alone. And so this was done in the 19th and 20th century, and about a third of these schools were operated by the various religious organizations. So in 1925, there were 60,000 Native children in boarding schools, and by 1926, nearly 83% of our Native children were in boarding schools. And so that would be my grandmother. When she was born and during her childhood, that would be the period of time that she was in the military boarding school near me. And so I think it's important to, you know, have that background overview as well, because while the focus is on the Catholic school, it was, you know, a conglomerate of organizations that, you know, that advocated for these types of schools to be established, and also General Pratt and the role that he had in establishing one of the first boarding schools, basically to, you know, to kill the Indian and save the man, you know, basically to kill the culture, to exterminate the people. But there's a much broader history, and I'll give opportunity for the other panelists to please speak as well.
Hi, this is Deborah, and agree with Patricia that that's exactly what part of the role was kill the Indian and save the man. I believe the policies that Patricia is alluding to is the doctrine of discovery, which was part of the implementation of how can I say this? If it was the land grab way back when the colonizers came, and in order to claim land, you had to be a human being. And the definition of a human being in the doctrine of discovery is it identifies with your religious beliefs, and more precisely, Christianity. So that meant that the natives were not considered human. And so they had to force assimilation, which is, you know, when you think about it, it's kind of complex. It kind of contradicts itself, because here on one hand, you know, they want to kill the Indian to save the man, but on the other hand, they're taking our people and forcing assimilation. And killing the culture, and you know, forcing their religious beliefs on us. So yeah, it's a complex history, and very, very traumatizing. So, you know, I believe that the other role that the church took was, you know, they were human trafficking. I mean, that's basically what they did with our people. I know my grandmother was brought up in boarding school, and, you know, to the day that she passed, her hair, I'm told, it was my great grandmother, her hair, I'm told, was almost as long as the floor. And I believe, I don't know because I didn't know her, but I believe it was because of them cutting the hair, which is very sacred to the Native people. Charles, do you want to say? I guess I'll pass the baton to Charles.
Yeah, my knowledge of the Catholic boarding schools is not too terrible much. I did attend back in the 2012-2013 school year. I did attend Chemawa Indian School in Salem, Oregon, and I left because of how bad the conditions were at Chemawa. There's a very wonderful Oregon Public Broadcasting series of articles that goes into depth about kind of just the poor state that the federal government is running the currently existing boarding schools. But beyond that, I don't have much to talk about in regard to Catholic boarding schools. Who should I pass it on to?
So to continue on with this, what was the curriculum in these schools?
For me, I think it's, oh, I'm sorry, Patricia, go ahead.
Go ahead, go ahead.
I was just simply going to say forced assimilation, but I know you have a much broader explanation.
Yeah, because I've done some research on this, but also just my own personal experience. And as Debbie stated that, again, I just want to cite the Civilization Act because it's important to know what these laws are, because it was those assimilation policies that the Christian missionaries and persons of good moral character, they were charged with the instruction of children in the habits and arts of civilization, while forcing our native students to abandon our culture, our traditional practices, and our indigenous languages. And I think it's important to challenge the Christian policies, because I think in today's society that continues to be at the forefront. And again, because of my own personal experience and my own personal and professional educational experience as well, the role of Christianity is not very positive for me personally. And that's an issue because of the doctrine of discovery as well. When you take a look at the doctrine of discovery and you begin to learn about the whole role of the doctrine of discovery and the role of the Catholic Church very early on, before, colonization, before, the settlers came to this land, that was already in place, across the ocean. And so then when the colonizers came, we were subjected to the doctrine of discovery, not only the taking of the land, but also the treatment of indigenous peoples. All we have to do is take a look at Thanksgiving and think that this is a time to celebrate. However, when you get deeper into understanding what Thanksgiving is all about, you'll begin to question yourself, well, what about Thanksgiving and all of these holidays, including Columbus Day? So it's important. I know we don't have time to get into the doctrine of discovery, but I think it's important to take a look at that because of the number of papal bulls, these policies that were done, and the fact that we were considered non-human. And it continues in today, where particularly Native women are considered non-human or subhuman people. All we have to do is take a look at the number of missing and murdered Indigenous women in the country today. And again, it goes back to this whole notion of doctrine of discovery, Christianity, distorted thinking. So going back to the curriculum, it's important to know that, because as children, we weren't aware of all of those policies. When I was in the school, I wasn't aware that I was being subjected to all of these policies with these Christian missionaries. And when you begin to look at missionaries and Christianity, and I began to question, well, are these individuals really persons of good moral character? What does that mean to have good moral character? And to also to instruct us in the habits and arts of civilization. Is society civilized today, is a question I would ask. So when we dig deeper into the curriculum, in my case, my grandmother was abducted from her home, from her family. And, just upon arriving at the military school, of course, that's all she spoke was our indigenous Yakima language. She was subjected to humiliation and shame by having her mouth washed out with lye soap. And so if you can just imagine being a 6-7-year-old girl and having to be confronted with colonizers who spoke this foreign language, of course there's going to be humiliation and shame. And so I think it's important to recognize that. And the kind of curriculum that was offered was not only the academics, but also industrial learning. And in my case, I feel that for me, I was subjected to indoctrination and brainwashing to the colonizers' way of life. And that continues today in our public school, because we're continuing to be indoctrinated and brainwashing. When you take a look at the philosophy of public education, you'll begin to take a look at that as well. For boarding schools, basically, again, the religion and curriculum was designed to assimilate our children. In those boarding schools, some of them are still in existence, even though it's cited in history that they ended in 1970. There's still a number of boarding schools that exist today. I've taught not only on my reservation, but I've also taught on the Navajo Reservation in Arizona, and you'll see those around you. During the boarding school days, our children were instructed in English and academics, and then of course on the industrial learning. Our children, in my case, my grandmother's at a military school, if you can just imagine, she was forced to follow the colonizers' religious way of life. The boys were clothed in military outfits and the girls in white dresses. And in the case of my grandmother, she was also dressed in those dresses. And the behavior that she had, I didn't question that, but later in life, as I became an adult, I began to understand a lot more about the way I was also dressed and the way I was expected to be a part of our family member. So during the daily life, again, students were forced to march to and from school, following the regimentation of military life, and that military life also became a part of my life. I always say that I'm a product of the Department of War, because when we take a look at the history of the federal government, we had today we have the Department of Bureau of Indian Affairs, but previously we were part of the Department of War. And so that has changed over the years, but nevertheless, we were still following that regimentation of military life. And in some cases, I've learned that football and band was provided for the community. While the students were partaking in it, it was for the pleasure of the settler community, so that they could have, they could have their own kind of life with football and band. And they were meant to support the idea that Indian people were capable of competing with Indians, and there are stories about that as well. And a part of that curriculum was that we were to be converted to Christianity, which was essential to the cause of these boarding schools. And we are expected to develop a curriculum, or they were expected to develop a curriculum of religious instruction, placing emphasis on the 10 Commandments, the Beatitudes, and Psalms. Again, implanting the ideas amongst the Indian people that we were the sinners. And so if you can just, again, imagine that kind of treatment and that notion and behavior, that we are the people who are subhuman. We're not human at all. We are the sinners of the land because we don't follow the 10 Commandments, the Beatitudes, and Psalms. And I'm critical of that because I was one who was indoctrinated and brainwashed in that, and not until I became older did I begin to understand and research that, that role of the federal government and the churches. And whenever I see, the role of churches, I began to question their motives and their own history and how they're interfacing with our tribal communities, and not only my family, but also interfacing in the education of our children today. So I'm being brief because of time, and I let Velma know I need to be off at 1 because I'm on another call with a national organization.
Thank you for sharing with us. Tanya, would you have anything you'd like to add?
First, I just want to thank the previous speaker. It was so well articulated. Reminds me of when my grandmother tells me stories of boarding school. Even though boarding schools were a couple of generations from me, I'm now in a role where, I'm influencing education every day here at Soxwaddle. And it's just so humbling to hear stories from those of us who were there. And I just want to thank the previous speaker. I don't have anything to add, but I'm really thankful that she shared.
Thank you. So how has education and curriculum of Native education changed to meet the needs of Native students today? And I'll start with Tess.
Good afternoon. Yeah, so again, thank you to the previous speakers, and I am so grateful that luckily things aren't that way anymore here at Daybreak Star. We're trying to do everything we can to reclaim the Native ways and bring culture back to the classroom. We're pretty much outdoors all day. We have a large focus on cultural aspects of our program, including music, singing, dancing, drumming. We had a powwow in July. We have a lot of family engagement events, always welcoming elders and family members into the classroom. A lot of family engagement events outside of preschool. We also partner with a lot of our other departments at our agency. And so we're trying to basically undo everything the boarding schools did. And it's not like something easy. It involves a lot of community, and it's been very challenging, but we know that because of our influence from our elders, that it's something that has to be done. It's healing for these kids, and it's healing for the teachers and the community to reintroduce all that culture to the classroom.
Thank you. Charles, would you like to add on to that?
I really think, I really want to echo what everyone else has been saying, and that boarding schools have had a immeasurable impact upon Native youth, even to this day, in my opinion. And I just think that there's a lot more education that needs to be done to recover from that and make other people much more aware of the problem and our past.
And Deborah?
Yeah, you know, for us, you know, I'm a director for a tribal program, so we provide services on the reservation and you know, in the community. And so we're able to easily meet the needs of our Native children, the unique needs of our Native children. We do it by way of a holistic approach of education. It's not just bringing the children into our program and providing the academics and getting them ready for kindergarten. It is meeting the needs of the family, the mental health needs, the, you know, if substance abuse, domestic violence, just everything, you know, in a holistic way. We use an approach that we call the medicine wheel approach. And, you know, we learn who, I say learn, we already know the families, but the idea is to learn who touches that child's life daily. Aunties, uncles, grandmas, grandpas, parents, and really meeting those are getting to know those family values, those family norms. That said, and also getting children prepared for kindergarten, because that said, you know, in our program and in our community, in our tribal community, you know, those children are isolated and they're surrounded by beautiful culture. And then we're preparing them to go into a world that they don't and are not familiar with. So we have Native children who live in two worlds. You know, they live in a world of their beautiful culture and their community and their family. And then they go into this environment, into this learning environment, Eurocentric learning environment that, you know, a system that was built to kill the Indian. And they look around and they don't recognize themselves in that system. And with that, you know, public schools aren't meeting those unique needs of our children by way of their policies, by way of their curriculum. And I'm even going to say, and I don't mean to be rude here, but I'm even going to say the biases of teachers in the classroom. You know, even at that level. So we have children that are coming in and you know, the role of the teacher is not just teaching and educating, but it's also learning. You're learning who your students are. And, you know, if there's a connection there between a teacher and a student automatically, then that teacher is going to be patient and respectful of that student as they're learning who they are. When biases come into play, sometimes, you know, teachers don't show the patience and the respect of our Native students. So to meet the unique needs of students isn't just change in policy, isn't just change in curriculum, it's change in attitude towards you know, who your students are and respecting who they are when they come in. And that could be simply, you know, respecting, for instance, when you're asking a question and waiting for the answer, and respecting that time allotment for the student, for the Native student to give that answer, and the time allotment relates directly to culture. You know, I mean, there's a lot of research around the way that Native Americans communicate. And, you know, sometimes it takes us, you know, 3 seconds or 4 seconds longer to answer a question because we're very thoughtful in the words that we use. We want to be precise. So anyway, you know, yeah, it's policy right on down to curriculum and the way that our Native students are treated, and engaging our families, and you know, having the school climate be reflective of our culture and our children.
Thank you, Deborah. Mr. Maltos, would you like to add on to that? So I'll go on to the next question. What does Native Indian ethnic studies mean to you? I see you smiling, Deborah, so I'll start with you.
Oh, thank you. You know, I love hearing about Native students, especially young Native students taking the course or majoring in Native ethnic studies. You know, as we know, it's a study of Indian history and culture and issues and contemporary concerns, etc. But to me, when I hear young Natives taking this course and I talk to them, it's a journey to reclaiming their identity. You know, as Indian people, too often in our community, children bear the burdens of the adults in their lives. And sometimes those adults, you know, carry with them alcoholism or drug substance abuse, you know, due to several things, historical trauma and several things. And so as adults, we may stray from our culture and those practices of our culture and such. But we've, and through colonization, you know, we've been typecast as alcoholics and drug abusers. And we bear those burdens. And a lot of our people, you know, turn to alcohol to numb those pains of the historical trauma. And in the interim, we may lose our cultural ways. But when I talk to young students, Native American ethnic studies has often been a passage back to reclaiming their identity and reclaiming the culture that they may not be getting, you know, as part of their community. You know, 70% of our Native people, maybe even more now, live off their reservation. They live away from their families in urban settings. And again, through US government policies. But so, yeah, so for me, Native ethnic studies, I love it when I hear young people taking that, because it, you know, in speaking with them, it's almost like a journey back to reclaiming their identity and who they are.
Thank you. Tanya and Mr. Maltos, would you like to add to that?
So I suppose what I would like to add is that here in the small rural town that we're in, I mean, we have a school of only a few hundred kids. And one of the ways that we ensured that there was, that we included Native studies into the school is that we brought back the Lushootseed language program, not just out here on the reservation, but we started the first high school course for Lushootseed, which is our native language here, and worked with the school district where the high schoolers would actually get credit for toward their language requirement by taking that course. And then in the preschool program out here on the reservation, we include Native culture in the classroom by fulfilling the nutrition learning requirements, for example, by having, you know, fry bread made in class, or showing them how we make it, letting them make parts of it themselves, Native music, those kinds of things. So we're trying to do what we can to integrate some of that in all the different learning levels.
I can add to that.
And Nina would like to add something as well.
And as the recreation director, we try to do things for the community here and the recreation department. Like we have drum making classes, beading classes, regalia, making classes for the canoe journey. And we're going to try to get these guys back out on the water to continue to practice the canoe journey, and maybe do some protocol songs and, you know, song and dance. So as a recreation director, we try to keep, you know, our community intact with their culture too. So that's my role in this is, you know, I want to make sure that we continue to do these Native culture things with our community member and tribal members.
Thank you. Tess?
Yeah, so going back to what I stated previously, culture is the major part of our curriculum that we're trying to incorporate. We still have to follow Seattle Preschool Program's high scope curriculum, but within that, we have found that we can make wiggle room and incorporate our Native culture and traditions. So it's a matter of making sure that we align what we're doing to meet the standards of the Seattle preschool programs. But luckily, they're very flexible and supportive of what we're doing here.
That's great. Charles, would you like to add on to that?
I don't have much to add at this time.
Okay, thank you. So my next question is, how can we further infuse Native American culture and learning into our education system?
I would say go to the Equity in Education Conference next year if COVID's over, because I plan to apply to present on what we're doing here at Daybreak if anybody's interested in learning more.
You know, we already got a slot for you, girl. It's not even a problem.
And Patricia, if you're still with us, would you like to speak on that?
Yeah, I don't know if you were going to also speak to the change that occurred with curriculum. So I wanted to address that a little bit, if that's okay with you.
Yes, please.
That was the previous question. I mean, I believe that the individuals would be able to talk about, how it's being done today, how curriculum or Indian education is being infused with Native culture. I think just the first statement about equity, for me personally, the type of terms we use as well, it becomes an issue. I'm working with colleagues right now with the state on some of these issues and the type of language we're using. So, in modern times, we use terms such as ethnic or ethnicities and those kinds of things. And I think you're there at the University of Washington. And in my case, I will often refer to American Indians and Alaska Native Studies. And the reason that I do that is due to the various roles I've been engaged in acknowledgement of our ancestors and our unique treaties with the United States government in recognition of our tribal sovereignty. And recognition of our sovereignty is important. And having been on my tribal council and various elected positions within my tribe, but also have worked regionally and nationally, the kinds of terms and language we use as well is important. And so in terms of our relationship with the federal government, because of those treaties, those agreements that we have with the federal government, the kind of terms we use are, is inclusive of Alaska Natives as well. So that's the mission statement language that's used by our tribes and our Alaska Natives in our relationship with the federal government. It's not to minimize the ethnic studies program. I agree with a previous state individual about our young students that participate, and it helps them as well. I had that similar experience myself. But when we talk about infusing ethnic studies, we cannot use that term without talking about tribal sovereignty. That is key. And as educators, and I'm assuming that people here are educators, policymakers, etc., we've got to talk about tribal sovereignty and what those inherent rights mean to us. I'm speaking to you from my homelands, and my homelands are the Northwest. It's not just the Yakima Reservation or the original 11 million acres, which is the entirety of Central Washington. I'm talking about, our regional homelands as well. And so when we get into ethnic studies, and I'm assuming that you'll hear that with the professors who are teaching that, if they've gotten to that level, that they'll begin to understand that about the role of ethnic studies. Because I have to go, I do want to speak a little bit about the changes, because I don't think we had the opportunity to speak about the changes, and that'll get us into some of the, where we are today. You had the question of how has education and curriculum of Native education changed to meet the needs of Native students today? In the early, let's see, it was maybe 1920s or so, 1940s, the Memorium report was conducted, and it talked about the major issues of education and how Native children were being educated, and that there was a poor response to the education of Native children just overall, particularly with the boarding schools and the day schools, those run by the Department of Interior, and also those that were in public education. And so that's, to me, is when it began to be addressed, and with these changes that were coming. And I think, like all of us here, you're here because of, the alliance of civil rights activists and advocates. I would hope that you would continue to take a look at that history, and I'm glad that you're hosting this today, because this is important to talk about the role of civil rights era. Because it's that civil rights era and that unrest that occurred in the United States in the 1960s that we got to, I believe, where we are today. And it's important to know the role of the Poor People's Campaign that occurred. Voting rights was an issue. The Vietnam War was going on, and I was a young student in college. And so I became engulfed in all of that. And I was one of those students that was protesting as well. You know, when the college where I was going, they were trying to make us as Native students pay for the tuition. When the college had a treaty in place that Native students, American Indians, Alaska Native students would not pay tuition. And so we all jumped in our vans, et cetera, and went to the state capitol in Denver to protest that. Because of that treaty, the college had an obligation to provide for the education of American Indian students. And so it's important, again, for us to remember and to understand our own history as well. And that issue of students paying tuition continues to pop up every now and then. And as tribal leaders, we have to, again, fight that issue. And we have to go back and address those treaty rights that we had. So again, it's important to know that history. And a part of that change came about with our intertribal organizations and tribal leaders coming together and saying, we're going to address these issues that were brought up in the civil rights. And so at that time, the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians was born, and it continues to exist today with, with 56 tribes that are a part of that intertribal organization. And throughout the United States, there are similar types of organizations as well that have taken up the call to support tribal sovereignty and to educate lawmakers and continue to be the advocates that we are. And over the years, I've been fortunate to serve as the chairwoman of the education committee for almost 30 years, and have been on the executive board of the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians. And so we look to these organizations to be our advocates as well. Later on, we had Robert Kennedy's report on the tragedy of Indian education, similar to the Memorium report. And it's, again, important to take a look at these reports and take a look at how they were analyzed and what their assessments were, because that led us to the Indian Education Self-Determination Act of the 1970s. Again, this was just shortly after the Civil Rights era, going into the 1970s, and where we really, as Indians, as tribal leaders and educators, we began to assume control of many of the resources that came into our communities. And all of us that are on this panel discussion, we were all a part of it regardless of where we live. We all are part of that process because it provides for the services today, such as Indian Health Services, pretty much the government of your tribes as well, the enrollment offices, et cetera. I could go on and on. And shortly thereafter, the National Advisory Council on Indian Education was formed with the Department of Education, and recently they've assumed oversight of the White House Initiative on Indian Education and Higher Education with the Department of Interior to also address the role of tribal colleges. And so throughout this process, we began to assume more and more control. So much so that under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, again, because many of you are educators, we've begun to put language into the ESCAA with the reauthorization of the No Child Left Behind, and today with the Elementary Secondary Education Act as well. As a matter of fact, we had a tribal leader who was on the negotiating rulemaking committee for one of the first times with the Every Student Succeeds Act. And so through all of that, Indian education programs have evolved today to where we are at, but we're still fighting those destructive policies that continue to be in place, again, because it takes advocacy and education about those policies, such as Native student identity is a major issue, and one that we've been fighting at the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians because of the dysfunctional federal and state policies, where you have students, Native students, who are identified and defined as in various ways that don't all align with one another, because we have students that are part of the Department of Education, Department of Interior, Health and Human Services with Head Start. As a former Head Start director, early childhood, infant toddler program manager. We've got policies from the Office of Management and Budget that define who Native students are. So this is a major issue that we continue to advocate and bring forward. So the changes that have occurred over these many, many years also leads us to the place where we are with these various programs that we have in place, such as our curriculum since time immemorial, since we're also working on Native student art projects through Native Voices Art, which is being held up as a promising practice. And then we're also working on science, Native science and education at the K-12 level. So there's much work going on today, but it's important to understand that history, because at every single step of the way, we're having to educate others as well, including ourselves, about our own history and where we need to go. I want to close with this thought. When we start taking, because I worked at the Superintendent of Public Instruction as the State Director of Indian Education, I've also been appointed by President Obama to the National Advisory Council on Indian Education to the United States Department of Education. And I have the opportunity to see the various reports about Native students and where we are today. We have a long road, we have a long ways to go with regard to education. When we look at the assessment scores of Native students today, along with African American students, we are at the bottom of every indicator in the academic realm. I heard someone talk about substance abuse issues as well. We have to own that history, and we are, because again, my role with Tribal Council, we are at the bottom with health-related issues too. Diabetes. I was on the original committee for the funding of diabetes in Indian country, and so I got to look at all of the health indicators too. So there's major work that needs to be done, and I appreciate the work that this organization is doing to help lift up the collective work and shared work that we are all a part of. So thank you. And I have to be leaving. I really appreciate this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate hearing your personal history and your knowledge. Thank you.
Yeah.
Deborah, would you like to add on to some of the thoughts and information that Patricia shared?
She did a wonderful presentation on the history of it all. And I wish that Patricia could stay with us longer, because I know that at NIEA, they worked in collaboration with the BIE on, and I'm not sure what the curriculum was, but it was it was a unique participatory history lesson developed in collaboration with Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers and such. And Patricia, I mean, did they go in as facilitators into the classroom to foster, the true history of Native Americans, and helped with the reconciliation of that history between non-natives and natives?
Are you talking about the blanket ceremony curriculum?
Yes. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, right. So I've also served as a president for 2 terms with the National Indian Education Association on a board. And so over the years, we've just grown and I think have become able to sustain some of the good work that's going on around Indian country, around the United States and Hawaii as well, because Native Hawaiians are a part of the organization too. And so these types of programs that are coming up, educators are beginning to share with our repository at the National Indian Education Association. And so that's who I'm getting on the call with. But in that case, it was with the community elders, that the individuals have been working with. And there's been training at the conference annually, and people can begin to learn about their own history, because what I've shared is important for communities to know their own history as well. And I've lived like in the urban area too, and I've always acknowledged the urban community and the tribal people that are part of that community. That land is so important. You know, I lived on the Puyallup Reservation, and it's important to acknowledge that history around the Tacoma and elsewhere too. So those communities, when you get deep into the history, say for instance, I'm going to go on again, but I've got to get to the NIEA, but just get deeper into the history of Seattle, you'll begin to learn again about what that history is about. Oh, I'm beginning to see people I know. I've just been so caught up in my presentation here. Hi, everybody. I feel like I want to say hi to everybody. Yeah, it's important. So yes, thank you, Deborah, for asking. So there's a lot of good work going on there. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we might actually just have to do one lunch and learn with Patricia and invite her back and just listen to the stories. So thank you so much, Patricia, for being here. And we will definitely reach out to you again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And make it 3 hours, not 1 or 1.5.
So kind of going off of everything that was just said, what, and this might have been asked a little bit or answered a little bit already, but what is education missing or not hitting the mark when it comes to Native education in Washington's education system? And I'll start with Tess.
So one of the things I've noticed, I'm a parent of 2 school-age boys in Seattle Public Schools, age 13. Ever since the law was changed that every school needs to teach the since time immemorial curriculum, I'm seeing that it's still not being implemented with fidelity by all schools through all grades. And so as an Indigenous educator, I find that challenging because my students went to Daybreak Star Preschool, so they had that strong foundation in Indigenous education that they're just not getting anymore, even though it's mandated in Washington state, unfortunately.
And Tanya, Mr. Maltos?
Yeah, with that said, you know, I had, you know, my kids have gone to school up here in Darrington pretty much their whole life. And that's one thing that I think is missing in the, you know, in the public schools up here is they don't teach Native culture. They don't even talk about it, you know, and I think it's very important that, you know, the Native voice should be heard, you know, in public schools. And, you know, there's a lot of prejudice going on, you know, in the school in town. And, you know, that's kind of hurtful too, because my kids had to deal with that, you know, a couple of years back. And I had to meet with the teachers, and I had to tell them how upset I was because all the prejudice going on up there. You know, it was non-natives hating the natives, you know. And but yeah, when it comes to Native culture, I don't see that in our public schools up here, you know, especially Darrington. So.
No, and I've found that when they do speak to Native culture, reference Native Americans in the curriculum, it's speaking about us like in the past tense. You know, Native Americans were this or they did that. We're still here. But in the curriculum, they speak about us like, you know, in the past tense. Well, let's not just, you know, promote the teaching of Native Americans as we were, but let's also write into the curriculum how we are now. We're still part of the community now. We're still here. But they speak about us like, you know, in the past tense. They're still teaching a false narrative around Thanksgiving. They're still teaching so many things that have nothing to do with fact. And the only time you would ever hear about Native American culture is something like a teaching on Thanksgiving in an elementary school where they put us in a ridiculous outfit and present us a certain way. So we have them out here in this cocoon on the reservation, and we do the best we can to carry the culture into the classroom between 0 to 5, but then once we release them or give them over to the public school, it's all it's all destroyed. And then they're taught to feel shameful about their culture or to hide it altogether because of the way that the outside world looks at us.
I think I think what's missing is the relationships. And it's not so much the tribes having, reaching out and having the relationship with the school district, because, you know, obviously we are forced to, because our children are going to the school district, to the off reservation school districts. If there's no schools, if the tribe doesn't have their own BIE school. So it's that engagement piece that I believe is missing. And even when we are engaging with the school districts, we see racism come into play, and biases come into play from the school districts. And I think the other piece that's missing is, even though it is mandated, it's not being enforced. OSPI does not take accountability to have the districts enforce the curriculum in the classroom. So it's several different layers of things that are missing for that curriculum, for our curriculum to be implemented into the classrooms. Lack of engagement, biases, racism, and because as part of the curriculum, the local school districts need to connect and engage the local tribe, to come up with a unique curriculum to that tribal community that those districts reside in, and remembering that those districts reside on ancestral lands, and acknowledging that as well. So it's a whole. We could talk all day about what the disconnect is, because there's a lot of disconnect. But really what it comes down to is OSPI, I believe, not taking accountability or responsibility to have the school districts, the local schools enforce that they do implement the curriculum and work with the local tribes.
May I ask a question? Renika,
yes.
may I ask?
Yeah.
Isn't that in statute though? Isn't that law that they have to, like, I know, I'm being silly, but let me start my video. Of all the problems that OSPI has on a daily basis, I am wondering if there's any way that we as an organization and us as a collective can start pushing on OSPI, because this seems to be something so incredibly anchored in what they call equity. And I'm just wondering, how do we as a collective really start pushing them to take ownership of something that is very well seated in their wheelhouse?
Right.
Can I speak to that, Sharon?
Of course.
Okay, so one of the issues, so I went to University of Washington College of Education, and their teacher prep programs do not touch on since time immemorial curriculum. And so one of the challenges is that we face is, teachers are 85% white women. How can they teach what they don't know? So unless these ethnic studies get embedded into the teacher prep programs, unless the since time immemorial curriculum gets embedded into the teacher programs in the Washington state colleges, these teachers are entering the field unprepared. And like I said, 85% white women, do you expect them to be knowledgeable in the field enough that you would trust them teaching your child on Indigenous rights and history and education? They literally can't teach what they don't know. So that's one of the major challenges.
And I think with that, you know, coming from a tribal community, I would say, and I'm not going to speak for all tribes, I would say that we don't want white people teaching the curriculum on their own. They still need to engage the tribes. They still need to have the tribes a part of the curriculum. I mean, the tribes are literally the foundation of that curriculum. And I know, for instance, Nisqually tribe goes into, we have two school, the reservation sits smack dab in the middle of two school districts, Yelm and North Thurston. And Nisqually tribe, for that piece, has a really good relationship with those school districts. And the tribal elders and knowledge keepers of Nisqually did participate in helping write that curriculum. And they go into the classrooms. The cultural department at Nisqually will go into the classrooms, and they'll bring the culture into the classrooms. So, you know, I mean, I think regardless of it being taught at the college level, that's fine. It needs to be an introduction, but I don't think that white people should be teaching it. But that said, I do need to say, even though our education department at Nisqually tribe has a great relationship with the districts in that piece, there are still some pieces where we can't get the districts to do certain things. Even though we have a really good relationship with those very specific people in the Native Education Department, or, you know, in the administrative department, for instance, Head Start, you know, I can't get one school district to come in and provide services at the center on the reservation to my children who are on IEPs. The other school district does, but I can't get that other school district to do it. So there's so many layers of even though we may have a good relationship with these people, sometimes we can't get them to do things that by law they are obligated to do for our Indian children. So yeah.
I hear what you're saying about like trying to incorporate the tribes. Working here at United Indians of All Tribes Foundation, I know that we do a lot of work and have a lot of strong relationships with the tribes. However, I feel like putting it on the tribes to make sure that this curriculum is developed and implemented with fidelity, I feel like haven't the tribes already done enough? Like, I feel like it needs to be on the teachers and the teacher programs. I just don't think it's fair to say like, oh, the tribes need to do all the work. Like literally for centuries, they have just been put in a place where they didn't do the damage. The damage needs to be undone by the people who hurt all the indigenous people. And I feel like we shouldn't add more to the plate of the tribe saying that you need to fix this. I think that we need to somehow turn the tables and make sure that it's the district and somehow put onto the shoulders of somebody else, not the tribes, that we don't burden them saying that, oh, you have to do this.
I don't think when it comes to tribal history, because we're gonna, I mean, you're saying that we put the burden back on the people who oppressed us and who harmed us. Why would we trust that they're not going to continue to harm us and teach our, you know, fake history? We want to make sure, and again, I'm not going to speak for all tribes, but tribes want to make sure that the real history of who they are as a people and their history is being taught. So you're saying that we need to leave it up to the very institutions that continue to oppress our children. Why would we trust that? I mean, that's just me. That's just me.
No, I agree. We definitely shouldn't trust them. They've screwed over indigenous people for way too long. But I feel like maybe if there was, if it was led by some Native people and there was oversight and some sort of way to make sure that the tribes are involved, but I would say that we can't put it all on them. It just doesn't seem fair to me.
So I'm gonna interrupt here for a second because I feel like the two of you actually right now, because so as a Latinx person, I always want to push for the Latinx history in this country, right? Like the idea that we've always been here, the border sort of crossed us, that be taught. But I have a really hard time thinking of our history being taught by biased, racist white people. And I think for me, and it's the same argument that we have when people say we just need more people of color as teachers, and my instinct knee-jerk reaction is, no, we need more anti-racist white people as teachers to sort of mitigate some of the harm that's been done forever. And yes, we need more people of color in everything, right? We just need, like, we need to take over and revolutionize. And I know Velma is the first one to start asking for a revolution. But I also think that racism is a white problem that needs to be solved by white people, and not put back on the shoulders of Indigenous, Black, and people of color to fix it, because we're often not given the power to fix the institutions and the systems that are oppressing us every day. But I also, I see Tanya's having like a reaction to this conversation, so I wanna ask you folks, because you're in a very unique situation in that a lot of us on this phone call are in the Puget Sound. We're in urban, suburban areas, and I feel like folks who are in more rural areas that are seeing this so much more closely get left behind, sometimes on purpose, sometimes on not. So I want to sort of pitch it over to the two of you to see, like, how off are we?
Well, this is a thought, and it's a crazy thought, but do you think our president kind of made it this way? I mean, it just seems like he allows it. He allows the hate to go on, and this is what our world has come to. It just seems like every truck that you see in town has a flag on it, and they're like pro-Trump. I mean, I got a flag that has a Native American on it. How would they feel about that? If I was rolling that around town. But I just think a lot of it has to do with our leadership in this world to this day. I mean, you could see all the hate going on. You can see all the riots going on. And you can see how divided our whole world is right now. And that's because of our leadership. It starts from the top. And you can't allow that in our country, because who's suffering is the Blacks, the Native Americans, the Hispanics. We're the ones that are suffering in this world. And that's my thoughts.
Yeah, it's maddening. Honestly, that's the reaction. It's maddening. It's frustrating. I grew up in this little sleepy town of Darrington. Again, there's a student count of 300, and now my children attend Arlington Public Schools, where there's that many in just my daughter's class alone, and I'm not seeing a difference. Up here, there's a little bit more racism because the reservation is so close to town, physically located closely to town. Down there, it's just that we've been completely erased. We're just completely erased. But so we're making noise, but the people who have the control to change the curriculum, change the legislation, where are they? We're sitting here making noise, but are any of them listening? We're not the ones in power. So we can make all the noise we want, but unless they're willing to actually help us you're right. If it's on our shoulders, we're making noise and we're trying to explain what's going on. But if they're not listening, what's the point? If their ears aren't open and their minds aren't open, what good is it going to do? That's the frustration, part of the frustration.
And that's who you don't want to teach your curriculum, you know, your history, right?
It's not affecting them, so
Right.
they just can't understand fully.
Well, and then you get that sort of subversive surface teaching, right? Like Black History Month is one quote from Martin Luther King, and you know, you might actually say something about like Harriet Tubman, but that's pretty much what Black History Month is about. And then suddenly you go back to white Eurocentric education, and all our kids know is that there was some dude named Martin Luther King, there was some dude named Cesar Chavez, there were no blacks before slavery. You know what I'm saying? Like that there were no natives before 1492. And I'm wondering if as a collective group of people, we need to start pushing further and harder on how do we educate. I know that there's a lot of stuff going on in the chat right now, but how do we get teacher prep programs, but also school districts and OSPI to take us seriously and take our history, you know, seriously, because, and I know some people are gonna sort of recoil at this, we are the majority. Like we are the majority, right? We are the global majority. We will be the state majority. And I don't think we can break the master house with the master's tools anymore. And I think that's something that they want us to do, and they want us to figure out how do we change the system with system rules. And I don't know that I think we've given that 500 years of trying, and I don't think we can do that anymore. So I want to respect everybody's time, and I'm going to kick it on over to Renika again to close us.
I was going to kick it over to you to close out, but but yes, everyone, thank you so much for attending this Lunch and Learn, being a part of this very important conversation. Thank you so much to our panelists for your personal history, for your knowledge, and for being able to come on here and share that with us. We appreciate it so much. We are realizing with a lot of these Lunch and Learns, the last few ones, that we either need to extend the time or do a part 2, because we leave every conversation with so much more conversation left to be had. So yeah, I kick it back over to, yes.
Renika, can I just add in there? You know, I believe we have a lot of teachers on in joining us today, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I would just like to add, you know, as a director of Head Start and early childhood education program, you know, we just implemented a trauma-informed approach to our curriculum. And just in a real quick nutshell, what that is instead of teachers, when children come to us, instead of teachers and administrators and everybody that works in education, instead of approaching the spirited child and saying, what is wrong with you? Instead of approaching it that way, the trauma-informed approach is, what happened to you? And when we approach it in that way, we start learning about the history of that child. And so if I really encourage teachers to change your mindset in that when a child comes into your classroom, especially a Native child, approach it in what happened and not what's wrong with you. So.
Thank you, Deborah. Ooh, sorry for the loudness outside on my street. So yeah, we will be having another Lunch and Learn in the next few weeks, I believe on mental health, correct me if I'm wrong, Velma, on mental health and how COVID has affected the mental health of our students. So be on the lookout for that and for that sign up. We also are still having our EEC face mask fundraiser. We have BLM masks and boat masks. So please be sure to pick up a mask or two. We greatly appreciate it. And they are reusable, very great quality, made from the Refugee Artisan Initiative. So yes, thank you everyone for attending. Again, thank you so much to our panelists. We really appreciate you being here. And I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.
Thank you, everyone.